Entrepreneurship is really the art of executing without all the resources needed.
I can say things that are unexpected, partly because they didn't fit me into a mold.
They can't kill you, and they can't eat you.
Constraints lead to creativity.
Pressure builds diamonds.
I learned this industry one phone call at a time, one mistake at a time.
Don't try to boil the ocean. One of the most powerful things you can do is have almost a wonder or amazement in being wrong. And so our theory became, this is inevitable.
Failure is not an option.
Welcome to Outsider Inc. I'm your host, Ian Hathway. After 25 episodes and 25 extraordinary conversations, I believe that we're building something special here. A community of founders, investors, and ecosystem builders who've succeeded from unlikely places. Hernan Cazá, who built a $100 billion company from Argentina when everyone said Latin America would never work for tech. Brad Feld, whose Give First philosophy is now powering ecosystems worldwide. Jared Polis, who went from internet entrepreneur to governor of Colorado. Linda Rotenberg, who literally had to create the word entrepreneur in Spanish and Portuguese because it didn't exist. Wade Foster, based in Central Missouri, who built a $5 billion company on just $1.3 million raised. Scott Dorsey, who turned Indianapolis into a tech powerhouse with ExactTarget's $2.5 billion exit to Salesforce. And so many more, from Argentina to Birmingham, from Detroit to Dubai. We've talked to people building, investing, and succeeding in places the traditional venture world overlooks. Somewhere around episode 15, I started noticing the patterns. Similar insights kept emerging from wildly different contexts. The same advantages kept showing up in the most unlikely places. The same necessary toolkit kept appearing in completely different hands. So we're doing something different. Over the next 2 episodes, we're stepping back after 25 conversations to ask, what are we learning? What's the outsider playbook that's emerging from this community? For the entrepreneurs just getting started or dreaming of your next company, if you've ever felt underestimated, under-resourced, or outside the traditional centers of power, this is for you. Let's start with something every outsider knows, being underestimated. There's this moment that every outsider founder has experienced. Someone looks at you, your geography, your background, your resources, your age, your accent, and you can see it in their eyes. They've already decided this isn't going to work. Hernan Cazá, who built Mercado Libre into a $100 billion company, felt it when he and Marcos Galperin were trying to get started in Argentina in the late 1990s.
We were totally convinced that what was starting to happen in the US with the internet and with the Amazons and the eBays of the time was going to happen in Latin America. And everyone would say, no, in Latin America, the internet will not work. Or going directly into the specifics of Mercado Libre's business model, they would say people will never ever trade with strangers and those kind of things. In Latin America, you need a higher level of trust. We knew that what we're building was very compelling and it was going to work. We knew it was going to be difficult. We knew we were going to have competition. We knew it was going to take time, but we're very convinced about it. So there was lots of conviction about that.
Everyone said no, the internet won't work there. People won't trade with strangers. Latin America needs a higher level of trust. But Hernan and Marcos had conviction anyway. They knew it would be difficult, knew there would be competition, knew it would take time. They built it anyway. The geographic dismissal, you're in the wrong place, shows up everywhere. Wade Foster, who launched Zapier out of a Central Missouri startup weekend and built it into a $5 billion company, grew up with a different version of it. Not people telling him it wouldn't work, but something he'd internalized before anyone even had to say it.
Coming from Missouri, there's these whole things in my mind where I'm like, oh, that's for other people. Other people do that. Rocket scientists do that. Geniuses do that. That's not for me. And then you kind of get to go experience it and you go, that's not so hard. I think I could do that. And you start to realize you sort of have been artificially constraining what's possible in your head.
That mindset, that's for other people, might be the most damaging form of underestimation because you do it to yourself. Wade had to physically spend time around the insiders of Silicon Valley to realize they weren't any more special than he was, that he could do what they were doing too. Isaac Saldana, co-founder and CEO of SendGrid, which he took public and then sold to Twilio for $2 billion, faced real constraints, and not just mental ones. Born in the US, moved to Mexico at 5, came back at 14 not speaking English well, married at 19 with 2 kids, working 2 jobs while going to school full-time.
What I traded at that time is health and sleep. I traded that
for time. Eat whatever you can as fast as possible and try not to sleep. So what that did to me is that when it was time to do a startup, it was more like, oh, I got this. It's not as hard as when I was 19. That time when I was in college gave me so much work ethic that now I just feels that it's much easier compared to that time.
Think about that calibration. Most people think startups are impossibly hard. Isaac thought his startup was easy compared to being 19. 2 jobs, a family, no sleep, trading health for time, work ethic forged by constraint. But there's another layer to this. It's not just the work you do, it's that people don't believe the work you've already done. Jewel Burke-Solomon founded PartPick, built novel computer technology, and ultimately sold the company to Amazon. But along the way to that successful outcome, investors still questioned the facts.
I so vividly remember investors simply not believing me. One of the stories I share is that I had an opportunity to read an investment memo that was written about PartPick. And in the memo, the word alleged was used 4 different times to describe things that were very obviously true. Okay. The funniest one, this was an investor that we were talking to towards the end of our journey, and we had already received an offer. Amazon was circling around, and the investor wrote at sort of the closing part of the memo that PartPick has allegedly received an offer to be acquired by Amazon. Just the fact that what was happening at the time, they didn't believe. That, I think, was really indicative of what my life and career looked like, honestly, probably to this day, in terms of always having to prove something, always being second guessed.
Alleged, not speculation, not rumor. They'd received a documented acquisition offer from Amazon. But when you're an outsider founder, it's easy to be second guessed. You're always proving something. Segun Otulana, who came from Lagos, Nigeria to Birmingham, Alabama at 18 and built a billion-dollar company, knew he'd face that questioning, that constant need to prove himself his entire career.
Obviously, moving from Lagos to Birmingham, Alabama has its transitions in terms of people understanding you and dealing with preconceived ideas of what it meant to come from Nigeria. In some cases, it worked for you. In some cases, it worked against you, and you learn and you adapt over time.
Segun showed up authentically and filtered fast. The wrong people left, the right people stayed. Linda Rotenberg, founder of Endeavor, which has supported nearly 3,000 high-impact entrepreneurs globally, encountered underestimation at a systemic level. When she started working in Latin America in the late 1990s, she discovered the infrastructure for entrepreneurship didn't just need to be built. The language itself was missing.
My driver has an engineering degree. And so I'm like, oh my God, why aren't you at? And I couldn't think of the word for entrepreneur. And he informs me after back and forth, there is no word for entrepreneur at that point in Spanish. Empresario meant you had government connections, one of the oligarchs of business. And I thought, wow, no wonder no one's starting their companies. They can't even tell their parents what it is they want to do. There's talent in these markets. There's capital in these markets. There is no trust. But in about 2004 in Brazil, the editor of the Brazilian Portuguese dictionary called up our team and said that we're adding the words empreendedor and empreendedorismo, entrepreneur and entrepreneurship, into the lexicon. So we went from not having a word to having words.
You literally couldn't tell your parents you wanted to be an entrepreneur because there was no word for it. Linda had to help create the vocabulary before she could do the work. And being the unexpected person in the room, the one who clearly doesn't belong by traditional standards, actually gave her a different kind of power.
I remember walking into Mexico, and literally it was me and probably 40% of Mexico's GDP with like 10 people in the room. And I had to convince them to take a bet on Endeavor. I can say things that are unexpected, partly because they didn't fit me into a mold. I could say things like, well, you're the big fish and entrepreneurship is about little fish growing. So why don't you think instead about eating the little fish, feeding the little fish? They didn't know what to make of me, but they knew that I had a story, that we had done some things that were real in places like Argentina, at that point, Brazil. And so they're like, all right, this sounds a little bit off, but we're going to go with it. And in fact, then a decade later, the headline was "The Big Fish Feeding the Little Fish."
When you're already the outsider, when they already think you don't belong, you have nothing to lose by saying the unexpected thing. You can challenge the most powerful people in the room. Tell them to feed the little fish instead of eating them, because the conventional approach was never going to work for you anyway. And sometimes that directness, that willingness to say what insiders won't, is exactly what breaks through. Of course, being the unexpected person in high-stakes rooms is one thing, but the underestimation doesn't stop once you've proven yourself. even after you've built something significant, even after you've earned your place, you can still walk into a room and have people assume you're not someone worth their time. Gail Goodman built Constant Contact over 20 years, took it public, and grew it into a $1.1 billion business. But even after all that success, she still felt like an outsider.
I certainly felt like an outsider raising venture capital. I was a first-time CEO and I was female, 40. I'd go to these networking events in Boston and I'd look like everybody's mother. I walk up to these two women and I'm like, hi, you guys founders, what are your businesses? And you could see they were like, we need to go find somebody important to talk to. An hour later, I'm on the stage telling the story. One of these women runs up to me afterwards and says, I had no idea who you were.
Gail had already built a massive company and she still got snubbed at networking events. But being outside the system, it builds muscle, work ethic, hunger, the ability to see opportunities others miss, the freedom to say unexpected things, the calluses to keep going when people doubt you. Those skills don't just come to anyone who wants them. They have to be fought for. And in order to win that fight, you have to develop them. Willie Schlacks, the grassroots entrepreneur who took equipment share from humble beginnings in rural Missouri to a category-defining platform on the NASDAQ, says a so-called normal upbringing might just prevent you from developing those skills in the first place.
I think if I had grown up in what we would call normal, it'd be quite a struggle. The biggest struggle to humans in this day and age is a moderately middle class or wealthy, easy upbringing. That's something I'd find challenging to surmount.
When you don't face constraints, you don't build the muscle. When everything comes easy, you don't develop the hunger. So what if we stop thinking of constraint as a liability? What if being far from Silicon Valley, having limited capital, operating in overlooked markets, what if those aren't disadvantages at all? What if constraint itself is a competitive advantage? I'm talking about the constraints every outsider founder knows. Geographic, you're building in a small market, far from capital and talent. Financial, you're raising a tenth of what Bay Area companies raise. Market, the infrastructure you need doesn't exist where you're building. Talent, you can't recruit the people you need locally. But what if these aren't just obstacles? What if they're forcing functions that lead founders to create new pathways they wouldn't have considered otherwise? Before Scott Dorsey co-founded ExactTarget and scaled it for more than a decade, selling it to Salesforce for $2.5 billion, most pundits doubted a big software company could be built in a place like Indianapolis. But they didn't understand something that Scott did.
A lot of benefits that come from building companies in a smaller community. I don't know that ExactTarget would have made much of a dent in San Francisco or Chicago, but in a smaller market like Indianapolis, you can feel the impact and it's very motivating.
In San Francisco, ExactTarget would have disappeared into the noise. In Indianapolis, the company mattered to the city. The constraint of a smaller market created something you can't manufacture in a major hub. Willie Schlacks experienced the same constraint with equipment share, but in a different way. He was building an equipment rental and technology company out of a small market in central Missouri. That forced something critical.
It enabled us developing scalable processes and scale far quicker than we would have if we were in a low constraint environment. Say we decided, hey, New York's great or Southern Florida or whatever. Those markets are so big that we wouldn't have had to really figure out scale and remote because our ambitions were global. So a big part of what is underappreciated when you have a brick and mortar aspect to your business is store number two. If that's just next door, you're not really doing scale. You have to figure out all your systems and process for scaling people and hiring when you're not there to solve the problem. How does the business continue on? How does culture emerge that's far beyond and impactful than you as an individual? Very quickly, we had to expand outside of the known. And if you look at what we achieved scaling in the industry, nobody in history had ever done that. Now, it's not because we were rocket scientists. It's simply because we had this constraint of small market and we had an ambition of the whole industry. The constraint of having a small market was a huge advantage because we were forced to figure out scale very early.
That constraint forced them to figure out remote operations, systematize processes, and culture that works when founders aren't in the room. Not because they were brilliant, because Missouri gave them no choice. Store number two couldn't be next door. It had to work remotely. That constraint forced operational innovation nobody else in their industry had solved. Staying in the Midwest, John Lensing co-founded OpenLoop, a telehealth infrastructure platform recently valued at over $1 billion. He and his co-founder made a deliberate choice to stay and build in Des Moines, Iowa, to live inside the same constraints their customers were facing.
We started the company, my co-founder and I, in the state of Iowa because he's from Missouri, I'm from Iowa. We wanted to do something to give back to the Midwest. We contemplated moving to San Francisco. New York was calling to us as well, but firmly believed in our roots, and that's the reason why we started it. We wanted to address a lot of the accessibility issues for rural America. And that just happened to be where we were from. And so it made sense to live in the middle of the pain while we were trying to build the solution for it.
Living in the middle of the pain, being far from major medical centers, watching patients drive hours for basic care. That geographic constraint gave them the understanding their San Francisco competitors could never have. But John experienced another constraint that shaped how they built: capital scarcity. Des Moines isn't exactly the center of venture capital.
I think capital constraints put some very realistic pressure on companies, and that pressure builds diamonds. It's like when you back a dog into a corner, they're going to fight like hell to get out of it, right? The same is true in our DNA. And I think the way our strategy has evolved, the way that business has evolved, you could view it as a series of some really significant pivots, but then a bunch of more micro pivots along the way. Some people might call it chasing opportunity. I would say it was calculated opportunity risk taking. And if you don't have that external pressure on the business to generate the revenue, generate the impact, generate the traction that you need to build a sustainable company, you end up wasting a ton of venture capital dollars on your initial singular mindset. And so that capital constraint, I think, provided a world of benefit.
Pressure builds diamonds. Capital constraint forced them to learn fast, pivot when needed, find what actually worked instead of pouring money into the wrong product. The scarcity became the impetus for finding product market fit. Doug Song co-founded Duo Security in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and sold it to Cisco for $2.35 billion. He saw the same thing John did. Capital scarcity creates discipline. But Doug went further. He argued that constraint isn't just helpful, it's essential, because removing it creates larger problems.
There's a discipline that really drives, because you have to focus on what matters. When you're flush with cash and someone else's cash, particularly, you end up sort of spending like drunken sailors because there's just no feedback mechanism around this, and there's no more internal locus of accountability. It's just very easy to go in and spread it around like peanut butter, all the kind of trivial kind of many things that you could do instead of really focusing the few things that actually are moving the needle for you.
You spend like drunken sailors because there's no internal accountability forcing you to focus. But sometimes the constraint isn't what you don't have. It's what doesn't even exist where you're building. When Hernan and Marcos started Mercado Libre in Latin America, they couldn't just plug into existing infrastructure the way eBay did in the US. The infrastructure simply wasn't there.
And in particular, when you go to solving a problem, you identify one problem and you want to fill that gap, but then you realize that on the way to filling in that gap, there are many other gaps that appear because the infrastructure is not there. So you need to be much more comprehensive in your solution. The first version of Mercado Libre didn't have a payments mechanism. And then, hey, people are trading things, but it'd be much easier if we could also solve the payment challenge. And if you were in the US, eBay had PayPal. And there were other mechanisms to pay for the items you were buying. Now to Latin Americans, you need to start building lots of things around that solution that you're building for it to work. So that's a challenge. You need to have a much more open mind, be willing to address problems that you think maybe are not yours. But if you don't solve them and nobody solves them, then you cannot really provide the solution where you're trying to build. But at the same time, if you end up doing that, maybe your model ends up being more resilient, more defensible, because you own not only that particular solution, but also the ecosystem that serves that solution.
The missing infrastructure forced them to build comprehensive, vertically integrated solutions. In the US, you focus on one thing and plug into existing infrastructure. In Latin America, if you don't build it yourself, it doesn't exist. That constraint forced them to own the entire ecosystem, and owning the ecosystem created a moat their competitors couldn't replicate. Mercado Libre is worth $100 billion today. The constraint became the defensibility. Here's the pattern that emerges again and again. Constraint doesn't just force you to do things differently. It forces you to learn what actually works. Shagan Otalana experienced this firsthand in Birmingham.
Constraints lead to creativity. You doing a job within the constraints of being a one-man band helps you think about efficiencies within that job that you can then pass on to the next person. I didn't have any resources, but I knew the bigger challenge was not the ability to build the software. I could build the software. It was my ability to sell the software and market the software that would be my biggest problem. So what I did was I found a really great engineer because I knew what a great engineer would look like. And I passed on a lot of the engineering work. I really started focusing on how do I become somebody who would drive traffic into the website and do marketing. When I now got a little bit of funding, we knew exactly where to put the money from a marketing standpoint to significantly drive growth because I had been doing the marketing work. So when October came around and we ended up raising our seed round, we knew this works, this didn't work, this works, this didn't work. Let's double down on what works.
Early on, Shagan had no choice but to become the growth engine himself. That season turned guesswork into instinct, and instinct into a repeatable playbook. When resources finally unlocked, he could move with speed and confidence because the fundamentals were already proven. A smaller home base forces repeatable systems. Limited capital forces focus and discipline. Gaps in the environment force founders to build more of the stack. And lived pain creates a kind of customer understanding you cannot fake. These aren't just hurdles. They're advantages your competitors can't replicate. Knowing this is one thing. Actually executing on it every day is another. Because if you're an outsider, you don't just think differently, you operate differently. It requires a specific toolkit, the ability to bootstrap with almost nothing, the hustle to acquire customers creatively, the scrappiness to solve problems resourcefully, and the resilience to keep going when others would quit. These aren't just traits, they're survival mechanisms that outsiders are forced to adopt early. Doug Song, who we heard from earlier, co-founder of Duo Security, raised just $14 million and scaled to $100 million in ARR before the exit to Cisco. He has a one-sentence definition of what entrepreneurship actually is.
Entrepreneurship is really the art of executing without all the resources needed. You don't have to starve, but maintain optionality. Right-size the business for your learning.
You can't wait until you have everything you need because you never will. Figure out how to execute anyway. Jason Seitz co-founded SliceHost in the mid-2000s, one of the first cloud hosting platforms, and bootstrapped the company to millions in annual recurring revenue within just 2 years, eventually leading to an 8-figure acquisition by Rackspace. When he started SliceHost, he and his co-founder didn't even hire a lawyer.
We went to the library and got a book, the NOLO book series. NOLO stands for no lawyer, and it tells you what to do. So we formed the business and handled everything ourselves, and it cost $50. It's a little bit like Goodwill Hunting. Get the Harvard education for $2.50 in late fees.
That's one way to bootstrap. You figure it out as you go. Sean O'Sullivan also had to bootstrap. He founded MapInfo in 1986, took it public, and later went on to found SOSV, one of the world's leading hardware and deep tech-focused venture firms that's backed over 1,000 companies. He's from a family of 9 kids, raised modestly in upstate New York. And MapInfo began with the help of his 8 siblings, each chipping in what they could.
We basically bootstrapped the business. We didn't really need that much venture capital. I have 8 brothers and sisters. They all invested $1,000 each, and my sister invested $5,000. Several years later, that $5,000 was worth over $1 million after we went public. We raised, I think, $75,000. It was our first friends and family round, and we were nearly profitable with that. I think we raised a total of $300,000 before we were profitable and never looked back.
When your first backers are family, you treat every dollar like it matters. That kind of accountability forces focus, discipline, and a path to real profitability instead of fundraising as a crutch. Guillaume Deswerick knows this pressure intimately. He founded Artera, formerly known as Well Health, a patient communications platform that's grown to serve nearly 1,000 health systems and federal agencies, and processing 3 billion patient interactions per year. Guy scaled the company to over $100 million in revenue while taking inspiration from an unlikely story.
There's a story that I reference often. It's about a Spanish conquistador who has a small fleet of men who's going to colonize someplace. He lands on shore. His men are getting off the ship and he says, burn the ships. And they're like, but sir, if we burn the ships, how are we going to go back? How are we going to retreat? And he goes, there is no retreat. Burn the ships. Remove any way that you could fall back to something. When I started this company, I quit my job. I had some life savings. And then I got 10 friends to give me $20,000 each. You talk about burning the ships. There is no going back when your friends' hard-earned capital is in your business. There is no other outcome than success.
When you remove the exit ramp, you show up differently. With your own savings and your friends' money on the line, commitment stops being a mindset and becomes the operating system. But commitment alone isn't enough. You need resourcefulness, the ability to get creative when conventional paths are closed. Michael Prager is the co-founder and CEO of AvidXchange, a fintech company he built in Charlotte, North Carolina over more than 2 decades. He took the company public in 2021 in a deal that produced nearly $5 billion in exit value. Today, AvidXchange has over 1,600 employees and processes more than $200 billion in annual payments. But Michael didn't get there by trying to do everything at once.
One of the things that I kind of learned previously to starting Avid Exchange related to getting a business off the ground is around the concept of starting kind of small and being really good at solving one problem for one set of constituents. And I think one of the things that in my coaching with other entrepreneurs that a lot of companies struggle with is day one, they try to boil the ocean and they try to do too much for too many people rather than being really good at one very specific thing. I would say don't try to boil the ocean. Start by solving a very specific problem in a really good way for a single customer.
Start narrow enough that you can win. Pick one customer, one pain point, and build something so good it becomes the foundation for everything that comes next. Wade Foster, who we heard from earlier, CEO of Zapier, took the principle of focused validation and made it even more rigorous. If you really want to know who has the problem, see if they'll pay for the solution before it exists.
I just wanted somebody to cut some amount of money. The $100 was totally arbitrary. And so the first 10 or so folks did it that way. And then eventually we switched over to a more self-serve model where people could pay us $5 to get in for the lifetime of the beta. That was the path up until we eventually launched. We certainly felt like if we made it free or didn't ask for money, we would just get a bunch of tire kickers. And that feedback might be different from the people who really had the problem.
Charging early customers filters signal from noise. The people who pay are the ones who actually feel the problem. And their feedback is the only feedback that matters when you're deciding what to build. John Lensing, co-founder of OpenLoop, wasn't working from a sleek startup office in the beginning. He was working from a cafe inside of a grocery store, sending hundreds of letters just to find the first customer.
Christian and I were handwriting letters, 300 of them to be exact, went bought all the stamps, sat there for hours, just getting our initial cohort of doctors to sign up. I mean, we bought like a $20 mailing list off of some like list site that gave us the physicians in Iowa. We got 0 responses, but we had 1 person sign up. Then we got our first office. It was a sublet within a larger office, but our office was 10 feet by 10 feet. We had a mini fridge and an old bun coffee pot for my parents, and we felt like we made it.
When you're bootstrapping from zero, that's what customer acquisition looks like. Inefficient, manual, relentless. Melody Vanderbaan is the founder and CEO of Max Retail, a venture-backed platform now serving over 2,000 retailers across all 50 U.S. states. But before that, she went bankrupt at age 21, lost everything in the housing crash, and drove a Sprinter van 36 weeks a year, selling designer clothes to boutiques. She had to hustle, learning her entire industry one cold call at a time.
I said, I'm Melody from DBC Showroom. I will place your brand into stores for a commission. So they gave me the samples, and I did not know what I was doing, Ian, but I knew I could pick up the phone. And so I just started calling. Oh, it's Melody calling from such and such. And they'd say, what are the price points? Say, let me call you back. Hang up, go look up what a price point was. Made the next call. Melody calling from so-and-so. Price points are $69 to $129 wholesale. They'd say, what are the deliveries? And I'd say, I'll call you back. And I learned this industry one phone call at a time, one mistake at a time.
When you have nothing else, resourcefulness is everything. But hustle has a half-life. The scrappy tactics that get you from 0 to 1, the pre-selling, the handwritten letters, the cold calls, eventually take a toll, and you start questioning whether this is actually going anywhere. That's when you need resilience, the ability to absorb the doubt, the setbacks, the slow progress, and keep going anyway. Melody discovered what she was made of at 21 when everything collapsed, and it's what kept her going long enough to get to everything that came later.
I think the gift that I was given that many never receive is realizing that it's okay to fail and you don't die of failure, Ian. And so by 21, I had already thought I gained so much and lost so much, and it was fine. And that just really built me from there on out to keep trying. And it's funny because if you look at my personality assessment from the predictive index, it says undaunted by failure.
Failure stops being terrifying once you've lived through it and you're still standing. When that lesson lands early, it rewires your relationship with risk and turns what if I fail into what if I try. Even legendary figures like Brad Feld needed that lesson. Brad is an accomplished author and co-founder of Techstars and Foundry Group. His Give First philosophy has reshaped how startup ecosystems around the world operate. But during the dot-com crash in 2000, when one of his portfolio companies was imploding, Brad woke up one morning and couldn't even bring himself to toast a bagel.
I really was not motivated. You have those mornings where your engine doesn't get started. So I'm drinking my cup of coffee
I'm gnawing on a bagel that I haven't even bothered to put in the toaster because I'm just so despondent. Most of the way I feel that morning is I just don't want to fucking do anything. I don't want to go out the door. I know what's in front of me. I know that there's a bunch of stuff that I got to deal with. And I'm certain that there's a bunch of stuff I don't know about that's crappy that's going to come at me because every day was just like another pile of new bad. And so Len came in the kitchen and I remember him sort of stopping and looking at me and saying, Brad, they can't kill you and they can't eat you. The hard stuff is hard. It's no fun. I'm not happy about it. A lot of times it's really emotionally stressing in many different ways, but it's just stuff. Deal with it.
Brad's story is a reminder that most days are not life or death. They're just hard. Once you can separate catastrophic from difficult, you get your agency back and you just keep moving. But there's another kind of resilience, the kind you need when the most powerful people in your industry look you in the eye and tell you your entire premise is wrong. When the validators, the ones who are supposed to know, dismiss what you're building as irrelevant. Kevin O'Connor co-founded DoubleClick in New York in the mid-1990s. The company later sold to Google for $3.1 billion, and what many consider one of the most important acquisitions in Google's history. His company spawned the term Silicon Alley, which branded New York's emerging tech scene as a counterweight to Silicon Valley. But in the early days, he was trying to convince the old media companies to sell advertising on the internet. And one of those meetings was with Michael Bloomberg.
I didn't really know who Mike Bloomberg was. And I was trying to get them to have us sell their advertising on the internet. And the guys looked at me. He's like, we totally get it. We believe you. Internet's great. But, Mike just doesn't really believe in the internet. They're like, will you talk to Mike? I'm like, yeah, I'll talk to Mike. What the hell? I don't know who the guy is. So I'm talking to Mike and I said, Mike, the internet's going to be big. Everyone's going to be using the internet. And he looks at me and he goes, I'm a fucking mogul and I don't use the internet. So I started laughing because I've never heard anyone use the word mogul other than discussing Genghis Khan. And Mike Bloomberg's got that great sort of hangdog face. He's not laughing at all. But that was what we ran into. And so our theory became, this is inevitable. The old guys running these media companies are going to die one day. And it all played out. The people that grew up with the internet and didn't know anything different eventually took over all these companies.
One of the most powerful media moguls in the world looked at him and said the internet doesn't matter because he doesn't use it. Kevin kept building anyway. He understood that being dismissed by gatekeepers doesn't mean you're wrong. It might just mean you're early. But what about when you're actually wrong? When it's not a gatekeeper skepticism, but your own miscalculation? When you ship the wrong product, choose the wrong market, hire the wrong person, make the strategic bet that fails. External doubt you can ignore. Your own failures, those you have to absorb. Isaac Saldana, co-founder and former CEO of SendGrid, who we heard from earlier, understands that failure isn't the end of the journey. It's only a stop along the way.
If you're a basketball player, if you don't make the basket, then what do you do? Well, you just try to play the game longer so that you can make more baskets. And so I think founders should be okay with failing because that's just part of the process. I've seen very, very smart people with funding not succeed. We see that all the time with even very experienced founders. It doesn't define who you are, the outcome, but we do get better over time.
You miss a shot, you take another one. The game isn't over until you stop playing. Chris Schroeder takes that idea even further. Chris founded Health Central, which he grew to over 15 million monthly users and led to a successful exit. He later co-founded Next Billion Ventures to invest in emerging markets and wrote the influential book Startup Rising about entrepreneurship in the Arab world. And Chris believes the real shift happens when you stop treating failure as something to avoid and start seeing it as the only path to getting things right.
You learn, I think, quite early in life, if you're paying attention, we don't want to be wrong. And so we do everything we can to prove that we're right. When you get knocked down the road, you start to realize that one of the most powerful things you can do is have almost a wonder or amazement in being wrong because it helps you to get it right.
Getting better starts with getting comfortable being wrong. Chris is pointing to a kind of humility you only learn through repetition, where mistakes stop feeling like identity and start feeling like information. Once you make the shift, you course correct faster and keep moving. Ultimately, it's about refusing to let failure be the final outcome. And maybe Hernan Cazá actually put it best.
The most important thing is that irrational commitment that will make them stay involved and work hard when it looks like you're failing. Because all companies at some point think that they're going to fail. We experienced that ourselves with Mercado several times. And you only go through those death valleys if you really believe that failure is not an option.
We started this episode asking what we've learned from 25 conversations with outsider founders. And here's what I keep coming back to. The outsider advantage isn't just real. It's structural. It's not about overcoming disadvantages. It's about realizing you're running a different operating system, one that's been stress tested in ways the insider's path never is. Being underestimated builds hunger. Geographic constraint forces systematic scale. Capital scarcity creates discipline. Missing infrastructure forces comprehensive solutions. Bootstrapping teaches resourcefulness. Hustle validates what actually works. Resilience turns failure into data. These aren't just compensatory skills, things you develop to make up for what you lack. They're competitive skills, the kinds that hardwire advantages your well-funded, well-connected competitors can't match because they were never forced to learn them. And here's the deeper insight. The learning never ends. When you're forged by constraint and built through struggle, you don't coast. You keep challenging yourself to grow. Serial entrepreneur Jared Polis, who co-founded Techstars and currently serves as Colorado's governor, put it like this.
Look, showing up and trying is a big part of it. And I always say you want to be in the deep end, just paddling above to keep your head above the water, right? You don't want it to be just so easy. You're like standing in the shallow end. You always want to be struggling and learning.
Jared is describing a builder mindset that chooses the hard reps early because that is where skills compound and confidence becomes real. That's what builds the outsider advantage. But that's only half the playbook, because once you've built something, once you've proven the doubters wrong and scaled against the odds, a whole new set of challenges emerges. How do you build the culture that actually scales and sustains your values? How do you separate your identity from your company when everything you are is tied to what you've built? And finally, maybe most importantly, what do you do to pay it forward in ways that actually multiply? Ways that build the infrastructure so the next generation of outsiders doesn't have to start from zero. That's part 2. We'll be back with it soon. If you want more from Outsider Inc., don't forget to subscribe to the platform at outsiderinc.substack.com. It's packed with highlights from today's episode and bonus insights you won't want to miss. You can follow Outsider Inc. on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn at Outsider Inc. Pod. You can also follow me on X at Ian Hathway. Outsider Inc. is produced by Spellbinder Media. We'll be back soon with another fascinating outsider conversation. Until then, thank you so much for listening. And remember, great entrepreneurs can come from anywhere. See you next time.